The story of Stacie Pannell. Stacie Pannell was born on September 5, 1967, in the small American town of Ripley, Mississippi. She had a younger brother and sister with whom she spent a lot of time and got along well with. Stacie was an energetic person with many friends. In school, she enjoyed participating in extracurricular activities. She joined the marching band, where she played a decorative wooden rifle. After graduating from high school in 1985, she attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Although it was about a 30-minute drive from her home, she decided to live in the dormitory. From the first days of college, Stacie was thrilled, made many friends, and joined the local marching band. On October 7, 1985, Stacie attended a training session after school, met up with her boyfriend, and went to a party on campus. At 12:30 a.m., she returned to the dormitory with her friends. They chatted for a bit, and then she went to sleep. At around 2:30 a.m., her roommate, Amy Wheeler, returned to the dormitory after the party but had lost her keys and had to knock on the door. The room was designed for 2 people, so only Stacie could open the door. However, there was no response to the knocking. Amy waited there for a few minutes before deciding to knock on the adjacent room's door. The dormitory was designed such that there was a common bathroom between the 2 rooms, so Amy could go through the bathroom of the adjacent room. A student named Stephanie Alexander lived in that room, who woke up to the knocking and opened the door. Both girls were surprised that Stacie did not respond to the knocking, so they entered her room together. The room was completely dark, and the only light came from a very dim lamp. Amy entered the room and saw Stacie lying on her bed, but one of her legs was hanging down, and she felt that something was not right with her friend. Getting closer, she was horrified to see blood on the bed. After recovering from the shock, she ran out of the room to get help. Other students responded to her screams, and the dormitory guard called 911. The police arrived and found an alarming scene. Stacie was dead, and there were traces of blood all over the room. There was a pillow over her face, and her underwear was pulled down. The investigators also noticed that someone had cut the mosquito netting of the window. Next to the bed, they found a wooden rifle that Stacie had used in parades with the marching band. It was covered in blood and wrapped in a towel. The police assumed the rifle had been used in the murder. Upon examining the crime scene more closely, forensic experts found a short hair on the victim's bed. All this was enough to form a preliminary picture of what had happened. Someone had made a hole in the window of Stacie's room, climbed in, raped, and murdered her. However, this version of events quickly revealed some inconsistencies. The size of the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for an adult to pass through. The window in question was situated at a certain height from the ground, which would have made the perpetrator's task more difficult. The police did not find the cut piece of the mosquito netting either. Furthermore, forensic experts examined the victim's body and found no traces of male biological material, casting doubt on the theory that the victim had been raped. At the same time, the pathologist confirmed that the wooden rifle, with a high degree of probability, was the murder weapon, as the injury characteristics indicated that the victim had been struck multiple times with it. Experts also did not find any defensive wounds on her body, suggesting that the victim did not resist the attacker. All possible evidence from Stacie's room was collected by crime scene investigators, but none of it furthered the investigation. At the time, DNA analysis was not commonly used, so the investigators could not examine the blood samples or other potential biological traces. Additionally, no fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, as the perpetrator had apparently wiped it clean with the towel. Despite the lack of leads, detectives still hoped that experts might find something in the room, so they decided to take fingerprints from all individuals who theoretically could have entered the women's dormitory. This task proved to be very difficult, as the police had to speak with hundreds of male university students and ask them to volunteer their fingerprints. They also took prints from all male staff members. The problem was that only girls lived in this residence, and a special key was needed to enter the building. Men could only enter in a few instances, such as being let in by residents or being college employees with a key. Nevertheless, the female residents frequently invited their boyfriends and male friends, which meant that the officers had to spend a lot of time collecting their fingerprints. However, in the end, this led to no results, since no matching prints were found at the crime scene. With no leads, the investigators turned to a psychologist and asked for a psychological profile of the killer. After reviewing all the available information, the specialist posited that the attacker was likely a man between 20 and 24 years old with a strong physical build and no criminal record. The psychologist believed that the crime was not premeditated. The killer saw an opportunity and decided to attack the victim. This description made the officers further doubt that the criminal had entered the room through the window, as the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for a large, adult man to pass through. Meanwhile, panic spread among the college students. The female students were afraid to be in their residences, fearing they could become the next victim of the unknown assailant. The fact that the police could not find any clues only heightened the overall anxiety. The officers continued to search for possible suspects and decided to investigate Stacie's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne. They searched his room in the residence and found nothing to suggest his involvement. Investigators found it impossible to establish whether Stacie Pannell's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne, had any motive for her murder. According to Stacie's friends, the couple rarely argued and had no significant issues. However, the investigators learned from Stacie's parents that before starting college, she had another boyfriend named Ben with whom she had broken up just a few months earlier. Ben and Stacie had been in a long-term relationship during school, and he had even given her a ring, hoping to marry her in the future. But Stacie ended the relationship, and despite Ben's reluctance to accept the breakup and his refusal to take the ring back, Stacie did not change her decision. Up until Stacie left for college, Ben repeatedly tried to meet with her, but she remained firm in her decision. The detectives spoke with Ben, who claimed that on the night of the murder, he was asleep at home. His mother corroborated his alibi, stating that he went to bed around 11 p.m. and was home the next morning. However, the investigators considered the possibility that Ben could have left the house undetected, gone to Stacie's college, committed the murder, and then returned home. Ben agreed to undergo a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. The operator could not determine if he was telling the truth. A second interrogation yielded the same results. This made the detectives suspicious, but without concrete evidence, they could not link him to the crime. Experts attempted to determine if the hair found on Stacie's bed belonged to Ben, but they were unable to reach a definitive conclusion. Since DNA analysis was not commonly used at that time to confirm or refute such evidence, it was not possible to do so. Due to the uncertain polygraph results, Ben became the prime suspect in the case, but Stacie's relatives did not believe he was capable of harming her. They described him as kind and well-mannered, always taking care of her. However, without evidence, the police could not charge him, and the search for clues continued. Later on, the investigators re-examined the case materials and noticed something peculiar. When examining the cut in the mosquito netting, they observed that the fibers were directed towards the outside rather than inside, indicating that the piece had been cut from within Stacie's room, not from outside. This discovery further puzzled the detectives. If the killer did not enter through the window, he must have had a key or entered with one of the residents. However, the police doubted this was possible since there was a guard in the dormitory who sat near the entrance and watched everyone who came in and out. For several months, there were no significant developments in the case. Then, the lead detective decided to seek assistance from Steve Rhodes, the sheriff of Illinois, who was well known in law enforcement circles for his unique approach to interrogations based on neuro-linguistic programming. He frequently spoke at police seminars and had a reputation for being able to extract information from almost any suspect and detect lies. Steve agreed to interrogate 4 people involved in the case: Stacie's neighbors Amy and Stephanie, as well as Ben and Tommy. In September 1986, he began his work, starting with Amy. She recounted everything she knew, and the officer found no reason to doubt her words. He then spoke with Stephanie, who said that on the night in question, she took an anti-inflammatory medication prescribed by a doctor and went to sleep. At around 12:30 a.m., Stephanie heard Stacie and her friends returning to the dormitory and talking loudly in Stacie's room. Stephanie went to ask them to speak more quietly. After her request, Stacie's friends left for their rooms, and Stephanie went to bed. However, Steve Rhodes, an experienced investigator, sensed that Stephanie was withholding important details. He accused her of lying and urged her to tell the truth. Despite Stephanie's insistence that she was not deceiving him, Rhodes continued to press her with questions until she finally revealed that she had returned to Stacie's room after the friends had left. This was a shocking development for the detectives, nearly a year after the murder. After a long pause during the questioning, Stephanie, to everyone's surprise, confessed that she had killed Stacie. According to Stephanie, she had entered Stacie's room for a chat. At some point, the conversation turned to Tommy Osborne, Stacie's boyfriend. Stephanie complimented Tommy, which upset Stacie. When Stacie demanded that Stephanie stay away from Tommy, the conversation escalated. After an exchange of words, Stacie slapped Stephanie, who retaliated in kind. The altercation became physical, and at some point Stephanie grabbed a wooden rifle next to the bed and struck Stacie, causing her to fall onto the bed. Stephanie then hit Stacie several times more until she stopped moving. Realizing what she had done after seeing the blood, Stephanie panicked and decided to dispose of the evidence. She locked the bedroom door, washed the blood off her hands, and then staged the scene to make it look as if someone had broken into the room, raped, and killed Stacie. She placed a pillow over Stacie's head, pulled down her underwear, and then cut a hole in the mosquito netting, hiding it in Stacie's closet under a pile of clothes. She cleaned the wooden rifle with a towel and took a shower to remove any traces of blood. Stephanie then decided to get rid of her t-shirt and the piece of mosquito netting she had cut. She locked herself in the bathroom and burned them to mask the smell of smoke by spraying a large amount of perfume. After covering her tracks, Stephanie went to bed and was only awakened when Amy knocked on her door. The detectives were astonished by this confession. For a whole year, it had never occurred to them that the killer could be a woman, let alone Stacie's dormitory neighbor. Stephanie was arrested and charged with Stacie's murder. 3 days later, she wrote a letter to her boyfriend, whom she had been dating for a week at the university, detailing the events and claiming it was an accident. She wrote that on the day of the murder she had taken some energy pills and was not thinking clearly. She didn't even remember the moment of the murder, but had seen it in nightmares throughout the year. Days after sending the letter, the case took another unexpected turn. Stephanie claimed that Steve Rhodes had put her in some sort of trance using his techniques and had implanted the confession in her mind. She insisted she couldn't have killed Stacie and accused the police of taking advantage of her vulnerable state to close the case. According to her, the energy pills clouded her mind, allowing Steve Rhodes to convince her over time that she had indeed killed her neighbor. In 1987, a judge held 3-day hearings to determine the truth of her statements. The detectives asserted that Stephanie had not been subjected to any undue pressure and that no one had hypnotized her. They argued that in her confession, she mentioned details only the murderer could know, such as where she hid the knife used to cut the mosquito netting. The detectives hadn't found it during their initial investigation, but after Stephanie's confession, they found the knife in the closet under a pile of clothes. However, there were nuances. Firstly, the girls were neighbors and often entered each other's rooms, so Stephanie might have known about the knife's location under different circumstances. Secondly, no evidence could confirm or refute that the net had been cut with that specific knife. Nonetheless, the judge concluded that Stephanie's initial testimony was not obtained through hypnosis or any other form of manipulation. The trial began in 1988. Stephanie's lawyers continued to argue that her confession was coerced and highlighted the lack of evidence against their client. They emphasized that the lie detection tactics used by Steve Rhodes were not scientifically founded and could not be used in court according to the law. Rhodes claimed that one could tell if someone was lying by observing their eye movements. Furthermore, Stephanie's lawyers presented medical examination results indicating that her cognitive abilities could have been impaired due to the energy pills, making her more susceptible to manipulation like hypnosis. The prosecution argued that Stephanie knew details unknown to investigators at the time of the interrogation, making her testimony credible. They also conducted a court experiment with a psychological sciences doctor attempting to hypnotize her, concluding that it was not possible to induce such a state in her. The victim's relatives also shared interesting information, stating that Steve Rhodes had mentioned Stephanie several times, considering her a problematic person and to some extent fearing her. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury eventually found Stephanie guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentencing her to 20 years in prison, of which she served 9 before being released on parole. Once freed, Stephanie continued to maintain her innocence and hired lawyers to revisit the case. During their review, the lawyers noticed similarities with another murder committed in 1993. At that time, a man named Charles Crawford attacked a girl who lived 40 minutes away by car from the college Stacie Pannell attended. There were some notable similarities between these two cases. Firstly, the other victim also attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Secondly, the perpetrator entered her home by cutting a hole in the mosquito netting. Stephanie and her lawyers believed that Charles Crawford could be behind Stacie's murder. Crawford was arrested in 1993 and subsequently sentenced to death. The challenge lies in the lack of evidence to prove his guilt in Stacie's case. However, there were significant developments. Stephanie's lawyers discovered that on the wooden rifle found at the crime scene, there was a drop of blood that did not belong to Stacie. DNA analysis of this evidence had not been carried out at the time, as a case review was necessary to proceed with it. Additionally, the victim's underwear was sent to an independent expert, and they were able to extract a DNA sample from an unknown male. This sample has not been added to the FBI's database for comparison with Crawford's DNA because a case review is required for that as well. Moreover, there is no guarantee that the sample found is related to the murder. Supporting the possibility of Crawford's involvement, the lawyers pointed out other facts. Crawford lived near the college at that time, and allegedly 2 witnesses saw him near the campus a few days before the murder. However, there is no reliable confirmation of this sighting. Despite similarities between the 2 crimes, there are discrepancies. The cut in the mosquito netting was made from inside the room to the outside, which discounts the possibility of an intruder entering from the street. Additionally, Crawford's height was 6 feet and 1 inch, making it unlikely that he could fit through such a small opening. Another contentious point is that the murderer used Stacie's wooden rifle as a weapon. If Crawford had really decided to enter the victim's room and kill her, it is hard to imagine that he would not have brought a weapon with him. Currently, Stephanie and her lawyers are still trying to obtain a case review that would allow comparison of the evidence with Crawford's DNA. Crawford remains on death row, having even spoken with detectives about Stacie's case, but the police could not determine if he was near the college on the night of the murder. You've just witnessed another unfolding story in Unreal True Crime. Lock in your support by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your insight could open the next story. Have a good day. A woman's body was found by police before midnight on the 25th of October 2023 in a school's gymnasium toilet. Police described the body as a woman in her early 20s and concluded her cause of death to be homicide. Police also reported serious head injuries found on the body, leading her to be unrecognizable when discovered. The next morning, the school sent an email to all students' parents, stating that the school would be closed for the rest of the week due to a critical incident, and to assure parents that no students were involved in the incident. So, what had happened? It was in May 2002 in Australia, specifically in New South Wales, that Jamie and his wife Peta welcomed their firstborn. The arrival of their daughter was a source of immense joy not only for her parents, but also for her maternal grandmother, who was immediately captivated by the little girl's beautiful blue eyes. Her warm smile radiated happiness, enchanting everyone around her. The kids had a privileged childhood setting along those idyllic coasts with their mild temperatures, where the locals knew each other well. Indeed, Jamie and Peta had earned the esteem of their community, and by extension, Lily also became very beloved. Later, the family welcomed their second and final child, whom they named Max. Jamie worked as the water polo coach at a girls' school in the economic and business heart of Sydney. It was there that Lily pursued her studies. Throughout her time at school, she proved to be an outgoing girl with lots of friends. Lily was an exceptional student who enjoyed helping her peers with less academic dedication. This virtue, coupled with her good nature, won her the affection of many. As her younger brother grew up, the young girl also dedicated herself with patience and care to helping him overcome difficulties. Always brimming with energy, she was keen to learn swimming, and later, following in her father's footsteps, took up water polo, becoming an accomplished player. By the time she reached high school, she was recognized by all as one of the school's top students. Between her academic commitments and her numerous extracurricular activities, her teachers always saw her versatility and high level of achievement. These values were evident when the young girl not only joined the school's theater group, but also enrolled in dance classes. In reality, her dream was to excel in both disciplines, and she soon achieved this goal. It quickly became apparent that her performances blended dramatic expressiveness with the physical grace of dance. Knowing she possessed this talent, Lily prepared to participate in a festival. At this event, contestants had the opportunity to showcase their skills to the public and compete in various categories ranging from theater and dance to other artistic representations. Moreover, constructive feedback from qualified judges could help them improve their standards and also promote musical sponsorship within the community. Lily decided to perform a monologue from Macbeth, William Shakespeare's famous play, infusing it with her unique style. Instead of relying solely on dialogue and facial expression, she sought to convey the emotional journey of the main character through movement. The result was a harmonious combination that captivated the jury and earned her second place in the theatrical category. In the sporting arena, the talented young woman also earned amazing rewards, becoming the swimming champion in the under-17 category. As expected, Jamie and Peta were bursting with pride. For them, every achievement of their daughter was a cause for celebration, like in 2018, when at just 16 years old, Lily passed her learner's driving test. Immediately, Peta and Jamie proudly shared the news on their social media. In 2020, during the high school graduation ceremony, Lily radiated light and happiness. Intelligent, beautiful, and possessing an independent spirit, the world opened up before her. By then, she had already decided to pursue a career in the sports world and enrolled at the University of Technology, Sydney, to study for a bachelor's degree in sports business management. In early 2021, with the start of classes, she took a part-time job as a water polo coach at St. Andrew's Cathedral School. From the beginning, the work experience turned out to be much more fascinating than the young woman had anticipated. With her vibrant personality, she managed to transform the classes into a unique fun space, winning over her students' affection. Her age also played in her favor, making her closer to the group, and everyone felt as if they had known her forever. Part of Lily's charm as a teacher was taking the time for details. For example, she wrote cards for each student, focusing on their personalities, beauty, and individual talents. It was there that Lily met Paul, the coach and sports assistant at the school. Born in 1999 in the Netherlands, Paul was the only child of a couple with a privileged economic position. The family moved to Australia in 2015 when the father was transferred to Sydney for work reasons. Once there, Paul enrolled in St. Andrew's Cathedral School, where he joined the cricket team. Over time, after earning the respect and admiration of his peers, he was appointed captain. He also actively participated in the school community by being part of the leadership team, contributing to the planning and execution of various events. However, not all his peers had a good opinion of him. Some considered him quite arrogant, and they were bothered by the way he approached girls, as if all were willing to fall in love with him. As it later emerged in 2017, once Paul graduated from high school, the institution offered him the opportunity to become an assistant coach for the cricket and hockey teams. He accepted the offer and, at the beginning of 2018, fully took over the role. In his new role, he was attentive and enthusiastic about motivating the students. However, under circumstances that have not been clarified, Paul returned with his parents to the Netherlands. During that time, he enrolled in a master's program to complement his sports knowledge. At the end of it, he gladly accepted an invitation to rejoin the sports department at St. Andrew's School. At the start of 2020, returning to the Australian dream, Paul reconnected with a former school and hockey mate. The two young men decided to share expenses and moved into an apartment in Kensington, a suburb located in the eastern area. As part of his duties at St. Andrew AS, he was tasked with welcoming the sports teams of other coaches after their respective classes, which included being aware of their schedules. This responsibility facilitated his interaction with Lily. In addition to his primary job, Paul joined the field hockey team at the University of New South Wales and also taught at a second institution. Despite these activities, he was quite a solitary person. Then, on March 18, 2020, due to the coronavirus pandemic, the Australian Prime Minister declared a health emergency and imposed a strict quarantine. The restrictions affected all sectors, leaving Paul not only without anything to do, but also isolated from all human contact. He spent a total of 18 months in solitude in a city that, although familiar, felt somewhat foreign to him. Like many people around the world, this isolation affected his way of relating to others to some extent. By mid-September 2021, as the restrictions were lifted and things began to return to normal, Paul resumed his activities. He rapidly became an essential part of the hockey team, to the point where his image was used in promoting the games. Amid this period of openness, he had already shown a particular interest in Lily, with intentions that clearly went beyond mere friendship. However, according to the students, she was not the only one to whom the young coach dedicated his charming efforts. In fact, some of his students viewed him as someone who inappropriately flirted with the school's teenage girls. However, these concerns were not widely known. In fact, many considered him an essential part of the team. His exceptional performance was crucial in leading them to the final of the Sydney Hockey League, even though they were defeated in that match on September 9, 2023. A few days later, Paul finally gathered the courage to ask Lily out, and she accepted happily, unaware of any rumors about him. Their first date turned out much better than either had imagined, leading them into a passionate and swift romance. However, the intensity of their feelings did not make them overlook the importance of discretion, especially considering their work environment. Thus, they opted to keep their relationship private. Initially, Lily kept her part of the agreement. But Paul, on the other hand, couldn't resist boasting to his students and began to hint that he was dating her. As expected, the rumor gradually spread throughout the educational center until, in the first days of October 2023, Lily learned of his indiscretions and felt betrayed. For her, it was not a minor issue, as the way he bragged about their relationship left her exposed to criticism, leading to disappointment. The romance was just 5 weeks old, and if she couldn't trust him, she was determined to end it. She couldn't continue with someone like Paul. Despite his insistence and attempts at excuses and justifications, Lily made it clear there was nothing more to consider. It was definitively the end of any interaction between them. In a matter of hours, Paul's hurt from the breakup turned into anger, not at himself for breaking a promise, but at her for not forgiving him. Such anger led him to imagine various scenarios, all aimed at harming the young woman. He then decided to go to a hardware store and there chose what he considered the ideal weapon, a hammer. On October 25, 2023, Lily left her house and attended her university classes as usual. In the afternoon, she went to the school for another workday with her students. Meanwhile, Paul rented a silver car and arrived at the school in this vehicle. He didn't get out, he just stayed there, waiting patiently until the activities ended. Around 7 p.m., when the water polo students left, Paul finally made his way towards the institution's gym. In his hands, he carried the hammer. Once there, he saw Lily enter the bathroom and followed her. All his movements were recorded by the security cameras at the location. Inside the bathroom, with no witnesses, they argued. Everything happened very quickly, almost as swiftly as their brief love story had begun. Then, amidst the shouting, Paul managed to gain the upper hand and overpower Lily. The newly purchased tool was used to end her life. He then took the girl's backpack and cell phone, and about an hour later, he left the bathroom. This sequence was captured again by the surveillance cameras. Afterward, he drove to the area known as the Gap, known for its cliffs. As he walked around for the third time, Paul was recorded by security cameras. Meanwhile, Peta and Jamie tried repeatedly to contact their daughter to no avail. Desperate, they decided to alert the police. The authorities immediately took notice of the situation and began searching for Lily. Around 10 at night, Paul sent a text message from the young woman's phone, asking Jamie to pick her up at the school without giving further explanations. An hour later, the 24-year-old perpetrator made an anonymous call to emergency services, reporting a body in the St. Andrew's School gym and stating that the case needed investigation. After hanging up, he disposed of the hammer and Lily's backpack in a garbage bin. He then abandoned the rented vehicle and walked to the edge of one of the cliffs, jumping and ending his own life. When the police arrived at the school, following the anonymous call just before midnight, the institution was in complete and utter silence, the opposite of its usual bustling energy. In the gym, as soon as the officers saw the silhouette on the floor, they realized their worst fears had come true. Lily's body lay lifeless. However, due to the severe injuries she suffered, investigators were initially unable to identify her. In the course of the investigation, the officers' first task was to seize the gym's security camera footage. Next, the team traced the anonymous call. It became quite clear that whoever had made it was likely to provide more information. Some reports state that the first thing they determined was that the number belonged to Paul, and they began to call him insistently. They didn't suspect him at the moment but wanted him to share everything he knew. Unfortunately, the young man did not respond to the calls. Shortly after, the investigators were able to locate where the call had been made from. Thus, in the early hours of the morning on Thursday, October 26, 2023, the police arrived at the Gap area and cordoned off the surroundings. After patrolling and conducting thorough searches, they discovered the hammer, which was immediately considered the fatal weapon. Finally, the agents found Paul's belongings. Around 4 in the morning, the police officers requested the school authorities to suspend classes until the investigation was concluded. This measure was communicated to all parents and guardians through a text message mentioning a critical incident, naturally causing panic to set in every home in the community. 2 hours later, a second considerably more reassuring message arrived because, by then, the school's management had decided to assure that no student was involved in the incident. However, after a sleepless night, Lily's parents received the devastating news of their daughter's cruel fate. Within minutes, the family's home was filled with neighbors and friends, all ready to offer as much support as possible in a situation no one could have ever imagined. Thanks to the gym's camera footage, the police identified Paul as the young man who had followed Lily. From there, authorities were able to outline the nature of the relationship between the main suspect and the victim, thus identifying a motive behind the crime. However, due to the lack of clues about his whereabouts, investigators began to consider the possibility that he might have taken his own life. Regardless, boats and even a helicopter were deployed along the coastline to find him. Through a statement, the police made the main suspect's name public, indicating that the nature of the injuries made it evident that Lily had been a victim of homicide. Although it was confirmed there were no previous domestic violence incidents between her and Paul. In the early hours of the next morning, Friday, October 27, 2023, a group of workers was preparing to start their day at a construction site near the top of one of the cliffs. However, they had to interrupt their work almost before it had begun when they were startled by the macabre sight of a body floating near the rocks. They immediately informed the police, who then established a new crime scene there and also organized a rescue team to recover the body. The unfavorable weather conditions made the already complicated operation even more difficult. Finally, by noon, the Marine unit achieved its goal with the assistance of a helicopter. The media was informed that the body was of an unidentified male victim, although officers had strong suspicions about his identity. Meanwhile, the remains were transported to the Forensic Medicine Service for a mandatory autopsy. The fingerprints collected were sent to the Embassy of the Netherlands for comparison with their records, leading to the identification of the man as Paul. That same afternoon, in their first public statement, Lily's family expressed the profound grief they were experiencing. Despite everything, they said, they were overwhelmed with immense gratitude for the community's support. Concurrently, given that the police investigation was ongoing, They opted to refrain from further comments. The director of the school also shared warm words of thanks to everyone for the love and support provided during these difficult times. She mentioned that Lily had always displayed qualities that made her unforgettable. Beyond the pain of loss, it was hard to overlook the fact that the tragedy occurred in a space where minors should feel protected. Aware of this, the school sent a letter to parents assuring them that, in the words of the police, the crime was unforeseeable. In response to the events, access to the gym was restricted for students, while the library was transformed into a walk-in psychological counseling center for students needing specialist help to cope with the impact. Amid the case's impact, a renowned local media outlet contacted a criminal psychologist and expert in criminal cases for an interview to help the public understand the dimensions of the occurred events. When asked about his impression of the facts, he stated that the victim's actions were typical of men with fragile egos, incapable of accepting rejection. However, he viewed the young man's relationship not merely as one of anger or hurt, but as malicious. He highlighted that there was no spontaneity, but a clear intention to harm, something that, in his opinion, was evident from the cruelty with which Paul sent messages pretending to be Lily, asking to be picked up when the young woman was already deceased. Overall, for the expert, Paul's was a narcissistic profile with psychopathic tendencies. Paul's parents decided not to repatriate their son's remains to their home country. Instead, they opted to cremate him and scatter his ashes on a Sydney beach. Lily's funeral took place on November 17, 2023. The more than 500 attendees were asked to wear bright colors and bring flowers, as Lily would have liked. Perhaps the most emotional moment of the day was when Jamie spoke heartfelt words for his beloved daughter and to all those who had gathered in her name. Although it took Lily's grandmother some time to express her feelings, she eventually encapsulated her thoughts about her granddaughter magnificently. She said Lily's brief life was enough to make a difference in many lives. Once again, dear audience, I thank you for your company. If you haven't subscribed yet, I warmly invite you to do so and become part of this great community. This is Unreal True Crime until our next episode. Good night.
The Horrible Case of Peter Porco. Peter Porco and Joan Balzano met in college in the 70s, where he was training to become a lawyer, and she was focusing on studying to become a children's speech pathologist. The young couple was very much in love and decided to start a life together. They married in 1974, and since then, they had settled in a house in Delmar, within Albany County, where they lived for the rest of their lives. Years later, the Porco family grew with the arrival of their first son, Jonathan, in 1981, and 2 years later, in 1983, their second and last son, Christopher, was born. Peter dedicated much of his career to being a prosecutor, but in his later years, when his sons had reached adulthood, he opted for a job that would allow him to be more relaxed and enjoy free time with his wife. Later on, when his eldest son graduated as a sailor and was stationed at the base assigned to him in South Carolina, and the younger Christopher moved to the University of Rochester campus, where he studied biomedical engineering, Peter left the prosecutor's office to start working within the Court of Appeals. By the year 2000, the Porco's place was empty, yet the family never lost contact with each other, especially Christopher, who visited them more regularly because the distance allowed it. However, by the end of 2004, their relationship began to go through a rough patch when Peter and Joan discovered that Christopher was not fully committed to his studies. His grades were not good, he hardly ever attended classes, and he constantly spent time partying with his campus friends. The news disappointed his parents, and as a result, a long argument broke out among them. A week later, in the early hours of November 15, 2004, someone broke into the Porco's house, and the discussion between Peter, Joan, and Christopher was concluded forever. The clock hands pointed to 9 in the morning, marking the time Peter was supposed to go to work. An important day awaited him and his colleagues at the court. Minutes passed, but Peter did not come through the door. His boss began to worry, as it was not common for him to miss work. But if he had reasons to do so, he always notified in advance. Something was wrong, and they had to find out. They called him repeatedly by phone, but in vain. Peter did not answer. Then, his supervisor sent a court security officer to check that everything was all right at the Peters house. The officer arrived at the place around 11 in the morning. From the outside, he could see that something was not right. The key that would open the front door was placed on the outside, but it also had a peculiar detail. It was stained with blood. Without hesitation, he called the supervisor and reported the situation. Both knew something was not right. The supervisor ordered him to enter the house in search of a concrete answer, but first he warned him to be cautious, as he did not know what he might find. Just a few steps down the entrance hallway, the officer discovered that he was inside a crime scene. The house was in disarray, and there was no corner that was not stained with blood. A massacre had occurred there. The officer reported the discovery to the police authorities, and they arrived at the scene immediately, launching a large operation at the Porco family home. The police found the place exactly as had been described in the phone call by the informant, following the bloodstains that led them to the main bedroom, where they discovered an even worse scene. On the matrimonial bed lay Joan, Peter's wife, who had also sustained severe injuries from the attacker, with the axe used as a weapon beside her. The scene was dreadful, drenched in blood, and Joan was horrifically disfigured, yet astonishingly, she was alive. Alerting the authorities with a raised hand, the paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital, despite her slim chances of survival. Her injuries were severe. Her skull was fractured, exposing her brain. Her jaw was shattered, and she had lost an eye, rendering her survival nearly impossible. In the ambulance, a case investigator seized the opportunity to question her. Aware of her surroundings yet unable to speak, Joan communicated through head movements. When asked if she recognized the attacker, she nodded, denying Jonathan as the assailant and confirming Christopher with another nod. Her repeated affirmation left no doubt. Christopher, her son, was the attacker. The paramedics, bearing witness to this critical testimony, urged caution in further questioning to prevent jeopardizing her condition. Upon arrival at the hospital, Joan underwent a 12-hour surgery, with her survival far from assured. Meanwhile, investigators, armed with the accused's identity, embarked on a thorough search for evidence to solidify Christopher's guilt. Returning to the crime scene, they meticulously examined every detail, piecing together the sequence of the attack. Initially confused by Peter's body's location near the kitchen on the ground floor, they were astounded by the autopsy results. Peter and his wife were attacked while sleeping, but surprisingly he had survived the initial assault of at least 16 axe wounds, as the injuries did not immediately end his life. Remarkably, on the morning of November 15th, around 5:30 a.m., Peter woke up as if it were any ordinary day, unaware of the gravity of his condition. He proceeded with his morning routine, washing his face and preparing breakfast and lunch for work, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded in his home. He wrote a check to cover the fines that his son Christopher had accumulated due to his reckless driving, and went out to the porch of his house to look for the newspaper. He noticed that the door had closed behind him, and he was locked out. Subsequently, he looked for the key he hid among the plants, re-entered the house, and collapsed. His body could no longer withstand it, so he lay down beside the kitchen. Every step, Every movement Peter made that morning left large bloodstains, but he was not aware of it. The investigators learned from the autopsy that the axe had caused wounds in the superficial area of the brain, but not in the internal part, where people store activities they frequently do, explaining why he moved normally that morning. On the other hand, the police authorities discovered that the entry had not been forced and that the key they had found on the door was the one Peter had used to re-enter the house, not the attacker. Moreover, the person they were looking for knew the security alarm code that monitored the house, but had taken the trouble to destroy the device. The house was in disarray, drawers open and belongings scattered everywhere, but nothing of value was missing. It was evident that the criminal had staged the scene to simulate a robbery with a fatal outcome. This theory was confirmed when they discovered that a protective metal mesh covering one of the windows from the outside was broken. Trying to open it, they noticed it was locked from the inside and only opened a few inches, making it impossible for a person to escape through there. The attacker had managed to flee the scene without leaving a single footprint or any trace of their DNA, but was not smart enough to hide their macabre plan. It was clear that their only goal was to murder the couple, and then it was time for the investigators to prove why. While Joan fought for her life in the hospital, the police authorities met with Christopher after he contacted them to inquire about what had happened to his parents. It turned out that the youngest son had received a call from a journalist who wanted information about the case, which is why Christopher called the police to know the truth. When they finally informed him that someone had broken into his parents' house, killed Peter, and injured Joan, Christopher showed no reaction. At no point did he seem overwhelmed by the severity of the situation. This caught the investigators' attention, but they had to remain calm and agreed to meet at the hospital where Joan was recovering. There, they had a 6-hour talk in which Christopher claimed that on the night of the crime, he had fallen asleep in a common area on campus. During his statement, a patrol went to the university where the 21-year-old studied, and the officers spoke with his peers, and what they told them did not help at all in proving his innocence. His peers described him as a friendly and humble guy, even though they knew Christopher belonged to a wealthy family that could afford great luxuries. He never acted superior to others. The police were alerted by these statements, as they knew the Porco family had a good socio-economic status, but they were far from being rich. They then understood that the young man had been lying to his friends all this time. On the other hand, the young students assured that they had seen Christopher on the afternoon of November 14th, in the common area where they gathered to watch television, and also in the morning of the 15th, but he had not been there during the night by any means. Everything began to indicate that Christopher was the only suspect, but then, 3 weeks after the incident, Joan woke up from the medically induced coma she had been in, and the investigation took an unexpected turn. The crime survivor was notified about the accusation she had made against her son, minutes before being admitted to the hospital. At that moment, Joan denied what the investigators were informing her. She said it was impossible that she had made such an accusation. She didn't remember anything from that day, and it was impossible that Christopher would attack them in that way. When she regained consciousness, Joan suffered from short-term memory loss, perhaps due to the trauma she had experienced, or maybe she just wanted to defend her son. The truth was that as soon as she denied Christopher being responsible for killing her husband, the investigation abruptly regressed. Thus, the progress they had made until then was paused for a moment. The authorities were forced to consider other possible lines of investigation that did not involve Christopher, so they decided to turn the search towards Peter's job. Since the man worked in the Court of Appeals, where family cases were usually presented as part of his job, some time ago, Peter had denied a man custody of his children. The violent reaction of that individual was accompanied by murder threats directed at Peter, which numerous witnesses were able to testify. The investigators pursued this theory and met with the possible suspect. However, it turned out to be a waste of time, as the man had a solid alibi. The agents returned to Theory 1. No one knew where Christopher had been on the night of November 15th. They then reviewed the timeline in which the house alarm had been deactivated, marked around 12:15 in the morning. At that same moment, the telephone lines had been cut. Then they knew they were back in operation around 5 in the morning. Furthermore, they accessed Peter's private information, specifically his email. What they found there were clues that brought them closer to their main suspect. Once again, everything led to Christopher. A week before the murder, Peter sent an email to Christopher, informing him that he had learned from his bank that he had taken out a $31,000 loan without his authorization. The man expressed his anger and disappointment in that message for having lied to him, and warned him that if it happened again, he would have to report him. Subsequently, he clarified to his son that Joan, his mother, was worried about his actions, wanted to see him, and that whatever happened, they could solve it. The investigators had found a compelling motive for Christopher to decide to end his parents' lives, but now it was time to find concrete evidence. They went once again to the university and requested access to the security cameras, and that's how they saw the footage capturing the yellow Jeep, which belonged to the suspect, leaving the campus on the night of the 14th, around 10:30 p.m. According to the agent's calculations, if Christopher had driven on the highway, he had enough time to reach his parents' house by 2 a.m. They needed to prove that he was driving the vehicle, so they approached the toll booths on the highway that connected the university to the house in Delmar. The employees assured they had seen a yellow Jeep that night. They remembered it because it was speeding. One of the witnesses said it was a young white male, but still, a piece of evidence was missing to effectively prove it. Then, the investigators embarked on a meticulous job. They knew that those who passed through the tolls received a ticket, which they then had to present at the next one to be charged the corresponding rate. These tickets were stored in boxes by the employees, who always operated with gloves. They requested the box containing all the tickets collected that day and sent them to be analyzed, one by one, in a laboratory in order to obtain Christopher's DNA from one of them. And so it happened. One of the tickets had been handled by the boy. Everything fit perfectly. They finally had what they needed to arrest him. It took the authorities a year of investigation, and in that way, they managed to arrest Christopher Porco for murdering his father and attempting to do the same with his mother. To regain his freedom, he had to pay a bail of $250,000, which paradoxically, Joan Porco and her friends took care of collecting so that Christopher could return to his regular life. The young man moved in with his mother while waiting to stand trial. During this period, Joan continued insisting to the authorities to leave her son alone and raised her discontent in a public letter, which was released in the media. In it, she asked the investigators to stop pursuing her son and to focus on finding the real criminal. But after several more months, the time for the trial came. Christopher arrived at the venue accompanied by his mother, whom he was arm in arm with, and the round of statements began. The prosecution presented all the evidence positioning Christopher as the sole responsible for the atrocious crime, while the defense attempted to exonerate him by questioning certain aspects. On one hand, they wondered how it was possible that if Christopher had been the murderer, he left the house without the slightest trace of blood. On the other hand, they claimed he could never have driven to his parents' house because no young person has that much cash on hand to stop for gasoline and pay at the toll booths. This was because the opposing side knew very well that the boy had removed the electronic device for toll collection, using cash to avoid being tracked. As absurd as these arguments sounded, the jury still had to meet to determine a verdict, taking into account all the information provided by the investigators. Christopher had a financial motive. No one knew where he had been on the morning of November 15th, until the cameras captured him driving his yellow Jeep, and he was one of the few who knew the code to the house alarm. Additionally, one of the witnesses at the trial was his former boss, the owner of a veterinary clinic where Christopher had worked and where he had learned how to avoid being splattered with blood in surgery. The jury had no doubts at the time of their verdict. On August 10, 2006, Christopher Porco, the younger son of Peter and Joan, was sentenced to a total of 50 years in prison for the murder of his father and attempted murder against his mother. The image of a united family that the Porcos had portrayed throughout their lives ended in the past, with the terrible tragedy they went through at the hands of their youngest son. Christopher's criminal behavior, which they had kept silent and managed to hide for years, finally came to light on November 15, 2004. The whims of the boy, to be someone he was not, to invent a life he didn't have, and a social status he didn't belong to, led him to commit a series of crimes against his own parents. The fatal outcome didn't just happen. To sustain the lies he had told throughout his time at university, he repeatedly stole belongings from his parents and friends, which he then sold on the internet, where he ironically scammed people. When it was time to deliver the products, he didn't, and later he impersonated his brother's identity and used his account to tell buyers that Christopher had passed away. On multiple occasions, he forged Peter's signature to obtain loans from the bank, and so financed the yellow Jeep truck. When he had no way out, he decided to murder them to keep the money and assets of his parents. Even days before the act, he approached a financial investor for advice, as he would soon receive a large sum of money that he wanted to invest. The case of Peter Porco clearly shows how far a person lacking feelings, but full of greed, can go. It also highlighted the impeccable work of the investigators, who, even with the victim against them, used all their tools, and even more, to finally do justice for Peter Porco. This case still causes controversy within the community, with some believing that Christopher's conviction was fair, while others believe he was not the author of the terrible murder. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.